All right. The subject matter for our topic today deals with giants. It deals with facing giants. It deals with overcoming giants. We're going to be spending some time looking at that because there are many giants that we face. There are many giants in the world, not necessarily literal physical giants, but giants, issues, troubles, trials. And in looking at the subject of giants, I'm reminded of the story of Christian and that is recorded in Pilgrim's Progress. Christian, of course, you're familiar with the story recorded by John Bunyan. Fantastic allegory that is so fitting. But there's one particular scene in that story, if you recall, and that's the time when Christian and Hopeful had fallen asleep by the wayside, and they happened to fall asleep on the grounds of one certain giant, and that giant was named Giant Despair. Let me put that up here so we can actually see a few pictures to illustrate what we're talking about. They had fallen asleep, and they were woken by this giant, Giant Despair, and his home was a castle nearby. It was known as Doubting Castle. And what ends up happening is early in the morning he finds them, and so he drags them over to the dungeon of the castle on the charge of trespassing his property. He doesn't give them food or water, and Christian and Hopeful are in despair. They're caught by this giant despair. They're in Doubting Castle, and Christian begins to grieve and blame himself for leading them astray and ending up in this problem. The giant beats them mercilessly on advice of his wife, and he leaves them unable to move. And he counsels them to basically end their lives. He says, "Why should you choose life, seeing it is attended with so much bitterness?" So that's all the giant could do. He could beat them, he could threaten them in the hope that they would actually end their lives. And as a result of that, Christian and Hopeful are discussing what they can do, and they are in despair. Christian feels that death is better than life. He says, "My soul chooses strangling rather than life," echoing, of course, the verse there from Job and the sentiment and the feeling of Job when he experienced trouble and trial and his giant. So it's fantastic allegory, really. And overcome by this condition of things, feeling like wanting to end life, Hopeful is encouraging Christian and reminding him of the experiences and the victories that he had in the past, even though their lot is terrible now. But surely God will deliver them, because they had heard stories of people who had escaped from this giant, from this dungeon. And the giant continuously, day by day, threatens them, beats them, and terrorizes them in the hope that they would kill themselves. And finally, in this dungeon, Christian and Hopeful begin to pray. They spend all night praying. And just before morning, Christian suddenly realizes that he had been a fool. You see, all this time he had a key in his bosom, a key called promise. And he had forgotten about this key. And this key, promise, opens any lock. It will open the lock of the dungeon in that castle. And so, sure enough, he pulls out the key, he opens the dungeon's lock, and Christian and Hopeful make their escape. And as they are escaping, the giant hears them escaping and he chases after them. But all of a sudden, he has one of these fits that he usually has, and he's incapable of holding them or catching them or pursuing them. And so they escape and they are back on their way, and they build a pillar, a memorial for their experience of the time that they spent in Doubting Castle and in the grasp of giant despair. So goes the familiar story. That's the scene. And it is so telling. It is so very telling. Despair and doubt were the giants that they faced. Do you face giants today? Looming troubles? Is it perhaps despair? Is it doubt? You see, we all have giants. If you are a pilgrim on the way to the celestial city, just like Pilgrim or Christian was, if you are a pilgrim on that path, there is no doubt that you will encounter giants in your experience. Christian and Hopeful are not the only ones who encounter them. Of course, that's a story, an allegory for our experience. How are you doing facing your giants? Are you overcoming your giants, or are you being overcome by your giants? Bible characters faced giants as well. One particular one I'm thinking of is, of course, Jeremiah. Notice Jeremiah's experience, recorded here in Jeremiah 12 and verse 1. Jeremiah is having a conversation with God, and he's troubled by something. He's grieved by something. Here's what he says. Righteous art thou, O Lord, when I plead with thee. Yet let me talk with thee of thy judgments. Wherefore doth the way of the wicked prosper? Wherefore are all they happy that deal very treacherously? You can see this is the trouble, this is the trial that Jeremiah was struggling with. Jeremiah was facing a giant. It was looming in his mind, in his head, and it was troubling him. It wasn't making sense to him. And what was it? That vice and wickedness were holding the upper hand, and it didn't make sense. It troubled him. He wanted to talk to God about it. But notice, he recognized that God is righteous. That's established. He recognizes that. But at the same time, things are not adding up. He is troubled by this, and he wishes to understand. And it is wearying him to consider such a thing. This was Jeremiah's giant. This was his trouble at the time. Now, again, I ask the question, what is your giant? Your giant that taunts you and troubles you, that occupies your thinking, that terrifies you maybe and haunts you, the one that fills your vision, the one that is really causing you to lay awake at night, maybe even freezing you into inaction, like it did with Christian and Hopeful in that dungeon, in the doubting castle, under the hand of giant despair. Now, this is the thing that we really need to examine today. This is the challenge I want to present to you, and the solution to the challenge, of course, which is the whole point of facing the giants, overcoming the giants, and having the victory. What was Jeremiah's experience? We see a few verses later how God answers Jeremiah and gives him an encouragement. And this is in verse 5 of that same chapter. And here is what God says to Jeremiah. If thou hast run with the footmen, and they have wearied thee, then how canst thou contend with horses? And if in the land of peace, wherein thou trustest, they wearied thee, then how wilt thou do in the swelling of Jordan? What God is telling Jeremiah basically is this: Jeremiah, you need to recognize something. If you think it's tough now, it's going to get tougher. If you're tired and weary now and despairing, and you're maybe in doubt and questioning while you are running with the footmen, well, guess what? How are you going to contend with horses? Horses are much faster and mightier than footmen. How are you going to put up with that? And if in the land of peace where you trust now, you're having trouble, you're weary, what will you do in the swelling of Jordan? The swelling of Jordan here means simply the pride of Jordan, or when the river Jordan would break its banks, as far as flooding, and it would be a lot of turmoil and trouble. And he's saying, if before that time you're having trouble now, what will you do when the floods come, basically? So what God is telling Jeremiah is a number of things here. God did not leave Jeremiah alone. He did not abandon him, but he informed him that, Jeremiah, it's going to get tougher, and you need to toughen up. Remember, I am with you. Don't give up. Don't despair. I can see everything that's happening. I am in charge. But you need to take courage. You're feeling down and out. You're feeling troubled by what's going on now. It's about to get harder. This is God's message to Jeremiah. So this is what I want to also share with you, brothers and sisters. What is the giant that you're facing that paralyzes you, like I said, into inaction, that causes you to question and doubt? Perhaps that even causes you to enter into a freeze mode. You don't know what to do. You don't know where to go. You seem to be incapable of making a decision. You can't even pray. You can't even think. At least in this case, we see Jeremiah actually praying. He's communing with God. Now, in this answer, like I said, God's encouragement is Jeremiah, if running with the footmen was tough, you need to learn to run faster. If being in the land of peace is wearying, you need to endure more. That's how God encouraged Jeremiah. He told him, Jeremiah, this is a small giant that you're facing. There is a bigger one coming, and you need to get things in their perspective. The beautiful thing is this: God did not abandon Jeremiah. God continued to speak with him. Now, as we go on, we see that Jeremiah presents a case here that we can relate to, because Jeremiah was tired of running with the footmen. He was troubled. Are you tired of running with the footmen? Are you tired of facing these giants? Are you puzzled? Are you feeling that, yes, God is righteous, I can trust that, like Jeremiah did, but things don't add up? Why is this happening, Lord? Why are you putting up with this? Why are you allowing this condition on state of affairs to continue? This does not make sense to me. I'm loyal to you, I worship you, I'm doing my best over here, and I'm meeting with trouble and trial. That's what Jeremiah faced. That's what troubled him. And the same thing happens time and again if we are pilgrims on the way to the celestial city. Sometimes we get puzzled. Circumstances in the world or circumstances in our personal experience happen that don't make sense to us, and they're very trying. Circumstances and situations develop that we didn't expect, and they become very oppressive, almost depressing, causing us to have anxiety, to have despair, to question, to doubt. We're not necessarily, casting our faith off in God, but we're wondering, and that doubt causes our faith to weaken. God tells Jeremiah, Jeremiah, get ready. There is more coming. And so if you're experiencing a giant now and trouble and trial, I want to tell you something. That giant is not the biggest giant yet. That giant is actually not as big as you think or imagine. There are bigger ones. And the question we really need to establish is this. How can you and I defeat these giants that we face, our giants? Jeremiah and his experience gives us a little bit of an insight. God tells him, Jeremiah, take courage, there's more to come. We're going to look at another experience of someone who also faced a giant and defeated that giant. And that, of course, is the famous story of David and Goliath, the eternally famous story across all cultures and religions. It's so famous is the story that it's no longer just a Christian story. It's now in culture, and it's used often to represent circumstances with an unexpected outcome, where the underdog will upset the situation that seems to favor one stronger side, and an unexpected win. And that's the David and Goliath type of story that is used there. Of course, the story comes from the Bible, but it doesn't only occur in the Bible. It's interesting that, of course, Judaism has it, even Islam. So it's a story that crosses different religions and cultures. So it's like this story that permeates everywhere. And we're familiar with the story, we know that story, but there are beautiful lessons I want to focus on in this story that can help us learn something of how we can face and overcome our giants and succeed in doing so. Not only so we can run with the footmen, but also to be able to contend with horses, as God told Jeremiah, get ready. It's going to get tougher, Jeremiah. Now we know the story. The story is all about David and Goliath. And I want to point some details here in the story. If you're familiar with it, you'll remember them. If you're not, maybe you can go read it after. I'm not going to go read it from the scriptures. I want to just build on some familiar details in the story. This story presents us with one person's expectation and outlook, which was different to everyone else who was there. And I'm talking, of course, about David. David's expectation and David's outlook of the situation and the circumstances was vastly different to everyone else that was there. For example, Goliath expected to win. Of course, the Philistines expected Goliath to win. The Israelites expected Goliath and the Philistines to win. In other words, they expected to lose. David is the only one who actually expected something different. He expected that God will give the victory, and sure enough, that's exactly what happened, contrary to everyone else's expectation. Now, keep that in mind because that gives us a little bit of an insight. How is your perspective? How is your expectation? Is it influenced by the majority? Is it influenced by what others are saying and feeling and expecting? Or are you like David, expecting the unexpected because you remember that God is in the picture? This is what caused David to have that different expectation. And as a result of his expectation, the outcome of the circumstance was vastly different to what the majority, what everybody predicted was going to happen and expected was going to happen. God in the picture makes all the difference. This is what God was reminding Jeremiah of. This is the experience of Christian and Pilgrim in that dungeon. Now, quickly recap, of course, you know the story. The battle was between Israel and the Philistines. They chose Goliath as their champion, whose battle with one other person would determine the outcome of the whole war rather than both armies fighting. That was something that happened at the time. And Goliath, of course, was a giant of over 9 feet tall. Some, estimations are based on the description we're given in the scriptures. And that amounts to something like 3 meters. So over 9 feet tall, about 3 meters tall. So he is literally quite a giant. He is big, he is large, he is tall, and he is decked with heavy armor. He is a seasoned soldier decked with heavy armor. Now, I'm painting this picture here. The Bible paints it because this is what everybody saw. And based on what they saw, they had this certain expectation. David also saw the same thing, but not only that. And that's what we want to look at as well. And for 40 days, this giant was taunting and challenging Israel to fight him, morning and evening. And the result of that was the Israelites were terrified. They were absolutely afraid. Here is how the Bible records it in 1 Samuel 17, verses 11 and 24. When Saul and all Israel heard those words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. And verse 24, and all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were sore afraid. So repeatedly we're told Israel, and the reaction of Israel was fear, terror from this giant. So this is why I want you to think, what is your giant that is taunting you day and night, that is causing you to have fear and dismay and doubt? The parallels are quite incredible. And just like Jeremiah, we have the same encouragement from God, the encouragement to hold on, don't give up, because it's going to get tougher, but you're not alone, as we will see. So if this sounds like you, if this sounds like your giants that are terrifying you, then this message is most definitely for you, and we can relate to that. So David, of course, is sent into this circumstance by his father to check on his brothers. And when he does so, he sees the giant, he sees the situation, he says, this is not acceptable, and he will go and he will fight the giant. He volunteers to fight the giant, much to the shock and dismay of everyone. Nobody even expected that. He's a young shepherd boy, and his brother is a little bit jealous of that, and how could he say that? But David's focus and David's attention was on God. God will give the battle. How dare this Philistine defy the Lord and the armies of the living God? So he goes to Saul and volunteers. Saul says, here, use my armor. And David tries it on and says, listen, I haven't tested this. This doesn't really fit and suit me. He decides to go with what he is familiar with. And he goes and he faces the giant. Before he faces the giant, he does something. As he goes in the valley there by the brook, he stops and he picks 5 stones, if you remember. 5 smooth stones he picks up. Now David knew and expected that God would give him the victory. It says, the Lord will deliver this giant, we'll see that, into my hand. He expected victory. So he stopped and he doesn't pick up 1 stone, he picks up 5 stones. Isn't that interesting? Why does he pick up 5 stones? What do they represent? You see, they represent something very significant. David acted out his faith in God. In other words, David had a plan. He didn't take just 1 stone. He had a plan. He knew this was a battle, and he had a part to play under God's leading and under God's guidance. So yes, the battle was going to be the Lord's. Yes, God will lead and direct. But David was not presumptuous. He picked 5 stones. In other words, he not only had a plan, but he had maybe even a backup plan. He had some tactic in his mind, and he trusted the Lord to lead him and guide him and to bless him. And so he took 5 stones, not just 1. He expected a victory, and he made provision for that victory. This is the important point here. He made provision for the victory. He didn't make provision for the defeat. Now I want you to think about something here. David, in picking these 5 stones, had to make 5 decisions as to which stones he would pick and which ones he would discard. He was looking for smooth stones that would fly better, obviously, aerodynamic stones. So he had to make 5 decisions in selecting these stones. I want to look at 5 decisions that we also need to make in facing these giants that we have, that we encounter, whatever they might be. Now, there are different giants for different people, and we need to be able to identify which giant are we facing, which giant is really troubling us, which giant is really giving us grief. Is it perhaps the giant of depression or uncertainty that's causing us to have inaction? You need to be able to identify your giant, the one who taunts you, the one who troubles you in your mind day in and day out, like the giant Goliath to the Israelites. 40 days, every day they would hear his taunts, morning and evening. The Israelites actually got so used to the taunts of the giant, they got used to the inaction and the frozen mentality in the face of that giant. Is this like you? Have you gotten so accustomed to your giant and the taunts of your giant that you have become accustomed also to the inaction in response to that giant? This frozen situation, frozen circumstance where you just can't act. You don't know what to do. That's what the Israelites had. They just didn't know what to do. For 40 days, they had no clue what to do. And the only thing that they could really do was to face the giant. But there was no man brave enough to do that. And so they remained in this state 40 days, interesting number, 40 days of inaction in the face of the giant. But David comes into the picture, as we're saying. But identifying the giant here is important. And they are different for different people. That's why the story is not only encouraging because of the way that God blessed David with that victory in the face of the Israelites, but it's also highly symbolic for what we can learn, because so many of us find ourselves in a similar circumstance. You see, we can identify with David very readily. Most people, in reading that story, identify with David rather than Goliath, rather than the giant. We feel like we're the ones who are disadvantaged, the underdog, so to speak, and the Lord can bless and give a great victory. But sometimes we are more like Israel, frozen in inaction. So, how is your experience? How is your response to these giants that you face? In other words, what is the biggest obstacle that you are facing right now in your experience, on your travels, on the way to the celestial city? Is it fear? Fear of failure? Failure now or failure in the past that is troubling you? Is it perhaps depression or anxiety or loneliness? Is it illness, sickness of whatever kind, mental, physical, an unexpected diagnosis that occurred? Perhaps it is even death of a loved one or a spouse or a family member close to you, and it's troubling and it's disheartening. What is the giant that you face? Perhaps maybe it's loss of an income or loss of a job where you have the prospects now are unknown. The future is unknown. You don't have work and you don't know what you're going to do. Perhaps it is family members who are not of the same faith and they're giving you trial and trouble, or maybe even children who are giving you a heartache at home. What about relationships? Is your giant coming to you from the angle of relationships? Whether it be trouble in the home, maybe even divorce, maybe marital problems, whatever it is in the relationships we have. Many times that is the source of great trouble and trial and a giant for many people. Is the giant perhaps an addiction that you might have, that you're struggling with, secretly even perhaps? Whatever kind of addiction, whatever you're caught on, drinking, smoking, immorality, food even, certain kinds of things. Is it an addiction that is troubling you? That's why I'm saying, think of the most troubling, trying circumstance that you're facing. What is it? That is your giant. You need to be able to identify your giant. And you need to be able to identify your response and your reaction to that giant. Because guess what? God told Jeremiah, Jeremiah, you're tired of running with the footmen. What are you going to do when the horses come, Jeremiah? There are bigger giants. This is more like training ground, Jeremiah. Running with the footmen is like training because horses are coming after. Brothers and sisters, there are bigger giants to face. And we need to learn how we can face and overcome the giants we have now so that we can move onward and forward. This is the challenge. And this is the aim, really, of the record of the scripture, and as recorded in Pilgrim's Progress, the story we looked at. What other giants might you have? Uncomfortable situation, perhaps at work. Maybe you have burdens. Maybe you have trouble with other relationships, work relationships. Perhaps you have to move and relocate, and that's a very daunting prospect to consider, and all the different aspects involved with that: selling, buying, finding, relocating, whatever it might be. Decisions that you need to make that you find yourself incapable of making. You're really troubled. People speaking evil of you. Maybe people even dragging you through court, having all kinds of trouble as a result of that. Whatever your giant might be, this is a long list. It's not exhaustive or comprehensive, but whatever your giant, whatever you are facing, you need to be able to identify that giant. And in light of that, you need to also make 5 decisions, just like David made these 5 decisions when he picked 5 stones, from the brook there. He picked them, he put them in his bag, and he utilized those. One of them was sufficient, but he had 5. One of them was sufficient to overcome the giant. 5 decisions to make. First decision, I want to go through this and make the practical applications that we can draw from that story. The first decision that we can make, that David made, and we see that illustrated in the story, is that David amplified God and minimized Goliath. His focus was on God more than the giant. Everybody around him, all they could see was the giant, Goliath, his taunts, day in and day out. That's all they could see, that their vision was full of the giant. David focused his attention on God more than the giant. He recognized the giant, he identified the giant, and that he's there, but that did not cause him to lose sight of God. If you actually look at the passage and read it in 1 Samuel chapter 17, you will find that David spoke about God more than he did about the giant. So seeing God more than the giant. David saw the victory through God, not the defeat through the giant. How is your vision? How is your perspective when it comes to looking at the giant? Is the giant everything that you see? Is it filling your vision so overwhelmingly that it crowds out anyone else and anything else? David was not thinking of the giant winning. He was thinking of the victory that God will give him. So how is your vision and how is my vision? David, as a result, was not beaten, even by the terrifying, taunting giant. So many times, our outlook and our perspective is what makes all the difference. You see, the circumstances for David were identical as they were for all the army of Israel. David didn't have any different or unique circumstances. He was seeing and hearing the very same giant. The difference was David's focus, David's perspective, David's vision. That's decision number one that needs to be made. He had confidence and trust in God, and he acted on that with great courage. That's an interesting component. He had confidence and trust in God. He acted on that with great courage. His vision was focused. And we see, of course, he went to fight the giant with unconventional weapons. He left the armor and the sword and the helmet and the things that Saul gave him, and he went with a staff and with a sling and with 5 smooth stones. And that is actually a very important component, because in the battle that we face, these giants that we have, we also need to remember that we need to utilize unconventional weapons. So many times we think of the weapons that we have naturally, our abilities, our skills, and we feel it cannot match this giant. It's not working. Brothers and sisters, we need to utilize the weapons of heaven, as David did. Here is how Paul puts it in 2 Corinthians 10 and verse 4. He says, "For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds." The weapons of our warfare are not carnal. They are mighty through God. In other words, they are supernatural. They're not the natural weapons. They're not our natural abilities, what we naturally can think of or react to in a situation. That's not how we can deal with these giants. We need to remember that we have supernatural weapons. The weapons that we have are mighty through God. David illustrated that in using unconventional weapons to overcome a seasoned giant, a seasoned soldier who was a giant, who had all these weapons. He used totally unexpected weapons. Focus your attention on God and remember that we have supernatural weapons. That's the idea, and that's the point here. So, to summarize it, as someone put it well, I want to repeat this. Don't tell God how big your giant is. Tell your giant how big your God is. That's decision number one. It all has to do with your vision, your perspective. What is occupying your eyes? Decision number two, David made this decision, and we're using the 5 stones as representative here. Okay, so there are 5 decisions he made, but we see in the story that there are 5 elements that we can learn from as decisions that we also make in order to face, that we can make in order to face and succeed in overcoming these giants. The other decision that David made and he demonstrated was he remembered God's leading in the past. He remembered God's past leading. Here's how he puts it. 1 Samuel 17 and verse 37. David said, moreover, "The Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said unto David, "Go, and the Lord be with thee." David recollected and remembered God's victories on his behalf in the past. That's a decision we need to make. Many times when we face a giant, we are so overwhelmed, we forget. We fall into despair, like Christian and hopeful. And we forget. We forget God's leading in the past, God's victories on our behalf, God's interventions, God's answer to prayers of other experiences in the past that we faced. David did not forget that. He remembered that. And he used that to encourage himself and to encourage his hearers, because even his hearers were telling him, "Don't go, you're not going to succeed." But he wasn't interested in their input. He simply looked at his experience, how God came through for him in the past and delivered him from these enemies, the lion and the bear. And he says, the same God will deliver me again. And his recollection of that was so inspiring and encouraging that even King Saul now said, okay, go, and the Lord is with you. Clearly you have faith in God, trust in God, more than I do, or any of the other people in the army. And David indeed went and triumphed as a result of that. Make note of and remember God's leading in the past. In your experience, the victories and triumphs that God brought you through. Look back on your experience and think of all the times when you had a circumstance and God delivered you. And let that occupy your memory so that in the here and the now, that giant that you are facing is not so oppressive and overwhelming that it drives out any memory or any hope and drives you into despair. Goliath actually became another victory in David's experience. Notice how this is recorded in verse 54 of the same chapter. It says, and David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. David took Goliath's armor and put it in his tent. These became the trophies. These became the markers. These became the new experience of victory that David can now recollect next time he faces another giant. So Goliath now is added to the list. Lion, bear, and Goliath. And the trophy is that he took his armor, he put it in his tent. So that's a reminder for David. Brothers and sisters, we need to set up reminders for ourselves, like an Ebenezer, of the Lord's leading and guidance in the past and his victories on our behalf. In our experience, we need that when we face fresh new giants. That's how you can run with footmen without getting too weary, and that's how you can contend with horses, as God encouraged and told Jeremiah. Don't forget what God has done for you on your behalf. Now that experience is both personal and general, meaning you can be encouraged by remembering God's leading and God's victories in the past of other people's experiences, like stories we read in the Bible, like this very encounter that we're reading here about David and Goliath. That's an encouragement. That's a general, remembrance of what God has done for others. But more importantly, you also need to make note of God's interventions personally on your behalf for you, what God has done for you in your experience. And actually, in the story of Pilgrim's Progress, that's exactly what Hopeful reminds a Christian of. His past victories in the encounters and experiences he had, and he reminded him of those as an encouragement. And as a result of that and the prayer, all of a sudden he remembered that he has a key, he has a victory, he has a way out of this giant's fortress or his dungeon. So that was decision number 2. Decision number 3, it kind of naturally flows from that, and it's quite obvious here, I kind of mentioned it already. But decision number 3 is to commune with God. And communing with God simply means pray. Pray now. Pray currently. Pray in the situation that you are in. That's what Jeremiah did. Jeremiah was troubled, he was perturbed, but he actually went and spoke to God about it. He prayed to God. David's decision to go and face the giant and his trust in God was a result of his communion with God. He prayed to God. Don't read in the account that he stopped to pray, but he had a connection, he had a communion and a relationship with God. And it's based on that he was able to go forward and face the giant and overcome the giant. So remember that. You don't and you can't face the giant alone. Just as David knew his God, he communed with him, so also let us commune with God. And that's why the scripture actually tells us in Ephesians 6:18, praying always with all prayer and supplication in the Spirit, and watching thereunto with all perseverance and supplication for all saints. This is part of the divine armor, the battle armor of the Christian. Praying always, communion with God always, in the time when you are facing a giant, in the time especially when you feel like you don't feel like praying, or you don't want to pray, or it's so overwhelming, or you forget to pray. That's the whole point of the battle, that the giant is trying to disarm you by causing you to forget the access to the weapons that you have. Prayer is a mighty weapon. It's especially needed when you are facing your giants. Pray. Don't neglect to pray. Don't forget to pray. Make an active, intentional decision to engage with God and commune with God in prayer. And this is how you can receive help from God in the present. Contact and communion with God in the present. Interesting, that's why David records in Psalm 46 and verse 1, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Now I want to play on that word present to say that God can help us in the present when we pray to him in the present, in the now. Don't think of, oh, I've prayed before, I've done all this before, and what I have, and neglect prayer in the present. God is a very present help in trouble. How you can connect with God is by communion with Him in the present, in the here, in the now, in the midst of the trial and the trouble that you are facing. David illustrated that very clearly. So he's not just the God of the past. It's good to remember the things he did in the past for you, the experiences and victories he gave you. He is also the God of the present. He is a present help in trouble. That's a good way to remember this verse. God is a present help in trouble. That's what Christian and hopeful needed in the midst of the dungeon. That's what Jeremiah needed. He prayed to God. That's what David needed, and he got. So it wasn't just about the past and what happened in the past and what God might do in the future. It's in the present. And connect with God in the present through prayer and through communion with Him. That's decision number 3, which of course brings us to the next one. Decision number 4, naturally again, flows out from that. In communing with God and remembering what God has done and communing with Him, then you recognize that the battle belongs to the Lord. The victory is actually the Lord's victory. That's exactly what David uh, determined. That's what David understood. That's what David believed. And on the strength of that, he actually had not just confidence in God, but courage to act based on that confidence. And he actually went forward to meet the giant in a very unlikely circumstance, much to the shock of everybody watching, especially the giant, as we read of his reaction. But here is how it's recorded in verse 47 of 1 Samuel 17. And all this assembly, David speaking to the giant, and he says, all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and He will give you into our hands. Notice the confidence that David had. The confidence was not placed in his skill or ability, or the fact that he has these stones and he's really good at what he does. His confidence is in God. The battle belongs to the Lord, and he acted courageously based on that. Brothers and sisters, I want you to remember, in facing your giants, you are not alone. The battle belongs to the Lord. Don't trust in yourself, trust in God. The victory is God's doing. David declared this, and he said it out loud in the hearing of everyone there, in the hearing of the giant, in the hearing of the army, in his own hearing. He said it out loud. Others heard him declare his confidence and trust in God that the battle belongs to the Lord. And that's exactly how it ended up happening. He won the battle. How do you show your confidence and trust in the Lord? Do you really believe the battle is the Lord's, or is this just a kind of theory? But when the rubber meets the road, you're kind of not certain. Declare and speak the truth of God's word that the battle is the Lord's. That's an encouragement for your faith and the faith of others, perhaps around you, who might be also struggling as a result of this giant, perhaps as well. David was not just doing this on his behalf for himself. He was now the champion of Israel. And as the champion of Israel, he was declaring to Israel, he was reminding Israel of what they all should have remembered, that this battle, this war, is not just physical, it's not in their abilities and skills. It actually belongs to the Lord. And here, let me show you what that looks like. And he acted confidently and courageously based on that. The battle, brothers and sisters, belongs to the Lord. David trusted God fully. Trust God fully. Trust indeed that you're not alone. Trust that these giants, the way to overcome them is by God's help and strength and divine ability. Commit fully to that. The problem many times that causes us to struggle and doubt and spend too long in this dungeon under the grasp of a giant needlessly is because we forget. We forget the past. We forget the present. We lose sight almost of God, and our vision becomes so consumed with this giant. That's why I want to encourage you. Remember what God told Jeremiah. You're running with the footmen, you're having a hard time. There are horses coming. How are you going to contend with them? You need to make some important decisions now. That's decision number 4. Trusting in God. And finally, decision number 5 is very obvious, is what happened. David made a decision to actually go forward and meet the enemy, as opposed to what Israel was doing, running the other direction and fleeing from the enemy. David went forward to face the giant. He faced the giant. He did not run away. We need to face the giant, brothers and sisters. We need to recognize, acknowledge the giant's there. We can't deny it and pretend it's not there, or run the other way, or just delay or procrastinate, or say, I don't want to deal with it now. The time will come when you have to face the giant sooner or later. You need to do so sooner rather than later. Because if you leave it later, then you spend too much time under the cloud. You need to do it. The sooner you do it, the sooner it is over and done with. The battle can be won. And so engage in the battle. That's the decision that David made. Of course, if you had heard the saying, it's quite fitting as far as battles and formations and tactics and strategies are concerned. And the saying is that attack is the best form of defense. Attacking is the best form of defense. Too many times as Christians, as believers, we face trial and tribulation and circumstances and giants, and we feel like, oh, I want to try and defend and just, keep things together. Well, guess what? What did David do? He went on the attack. He not only faced the giant, he engaged with the giant. He ran towards him and engaged in the battle. David, we're told, he hasted. He ran towards the army to meet the Philistine. He didn't wait and say, okay, let's see what the giant will do. Maybe he'll swing his sword and I'll try and duck, or I'll try and defend. No, what he was thinking of was victory, defeat, and he went on the attack. And the giant didn't expect it. He was still busy laughing at David and the prospect of a shepherd boy dressed like a shepherd coming to meet the seasoned champion. And while he was still busy laughing at that, David was already taking aim and landing that stone in the middle between his eyes. That's how David's approach was. He engaged with the giant. He didn't wait to try and duck and defend. So attacking is the best defense. Now, interestingly enough, there is this component Jesus referred to in his famous saying, and it's something that many people don't focus on in this particular verse. I want to read it here from Matthew 16 and verse 18, where Jesus speaks in response to Peter after he asked him, "Who do you say that I am?" Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Here's what Jesus says: "And I say also unto thee, that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." Now, we use this verse to talk about the sonship of Christ, the foundation of the church. It's all very true. But I want you to think of the picture here. Jesus presents the picture of a battle, picture of an army, that the church is engaged in a battle. And how the church is engaged in a battle, it says, the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. So there is a battle between the church and hell, okay? And the gates of hell. I want you to think about it this way. What kind of a weapon is a gate? A gate is a defensive weapon. In a city, they close the gates, that's to defend against the invading army. And when the church, it says, the gates of hell shall not prevail against the church. What does that tell you that the church is doing? The church is on the offensive. The church is attacking and hell is defending, and the gates are a defensive weapon. So attacking is the best form of defense. That's what Jesus is talking about his church as a result of being established on him and his true identity as the divine Son of God. The church is on the attacking. So with your giants, don't cower in fear and uncertainty. Remember what Jesus says: if you're built on the rock, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, then you as a member of this church, you go on the attack, you go on the offensive, assured of the victory, so that the enemy is on the defensive, trying to counter, and the gates of hell will not be able to prevail. The battle is the Lord's if you are built firmly on that rock. David demonstrated that, and that's for us. That's decision number 5 to make, brothers and sisters, when it comes to facing these giants. So let me summarize them here quickly. As we looked at them, these 5 decisions that David made are decisions for us to make in facing our giants and overcoming them. Number 1, focus your vision. Don't be filled with the giant and the trouble and the problem and lose sight of God. Focus your vision on God. Have a true perspective of the situation. Number 2, remember the Lord's leading in the past for others, in the past for your experience. Remember that and let that encourage you. Don't lose sight of that. Number 3, commune with God now in the present. Pray. Talk with the Lord. If you're troubled, talk to the Lord about your trouble. Sometimes we feel it's not right to talk about God about our troubles, our trials, our doubts. We feel, well, that's wrong, that's not good. Look at what Jeremiah did. He says, Lord, I know you're righteous, but this is troubling me. What's going on? This wickedness everywhere. I'm paraphrasing it, okay? So talk to the Lord. He's the Lord still. But Jeremiah spoke to him. He communed with him. Number 4, trust God, because the battle is the Lord's. Trust God, commit to him. Don't trust in your ability or lack thereof and look at how woefully unequipped you are, and this is not happening to you. How is this happening to you? This is not really fair because you can't deal with this. Remember, the battle belongs to the Lord. God will not tempt you above that you're able to bear. And number 5, finally, what we just covered, attack is the best defense. Take the prerogative and understand the meaning of being built on Christ as the Son of God. That gives us supernatural power, where the church now and every believer in the church is to be a fearless warrior, to go on the attack. That's what David was. He didn't perhaps look like it by his appearance, but David behaved as a fearless warrior, and he won the battle because he went in the name of the Lord. God, brothers and sisters, gave us great, exceeding great, and precious promises. That's exactly what gave Christian and hopeful the way out from the dungeon, out of the hand of giant despair and doubting castle, and they were able to escape. He escaped the doubting castle by that key, the promises of God's word. Let's remember God's promises. God's promises that we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. Let us remember the power that is available to us. This is the problem. Too often we forget about these exceeding great and precious promises. We get bamboozled by the giant and the taunts of the giant and the ongoing circumstance, and we get so down and out, and we get like Jeremiah. We feel, Lord, I'm struggling here. What's going on? And God's like, listen, you haven't seen anything yet. You're familiar with the saying, of course, in the world, when the way or when the road gets tough or rough, the tough get going, right? That's what God was encouraging Jeremiah with. You see, many times we need to consider, brothers and sisters, that we are actually in a battle. There are big giants now, but there are even greater giants. How will we be able to contend with horses? We need to be seasoned battle soldiers. You know what makes a soldier a seasoned soldier? Is the battles that he engages in. It's not that he just signs up or is called a soldier. He's a veteran. He's a seasoned soldier because of the battles that he engages in. So many times, God allows certain circumstances to develop so that he can train us as soldiers, so we can make the right decisions in facing the little giants, so that we can graduate to be able to face the bigger giants. He wants us to be seasoned soldiers, not just soldiers by name. And that's his message to Peter and to the church when he says, listen, if you're built on this rock, when I establish my church, my people will know and recognize that they will be soldiers in this battle, and I am with them, and they will be able to face whatever enemy, and the enemy will be on the defense, on the run, and the gates of hell will not be able to prevail. So how can you contend with horses? By making decisions here and now as you are running with footmen, how you face your giants. God did not abandon Jeremiah. He encouraged him. He wasn't alone. God was with David. In like manner, in the allegory in Pilgrim's Progress, God was with Christian and hopeful, even though they had forgotten, but through prayer they remembered they had the way out. The same is with us, brothers and sisters. Let me remind you of this verse about contending with horses. Notice how, when you put these two verses together, I like the wording because it's very similar. How does it happen? How do we contend with horses, as God told Jeremiah? Here is the answer from Isaiah 49 and verse 25. But thus saith the Lord, even the captives of the mighty shall be taken away, and the prey of the terrible shall be delivered. For I will contend with him that contendeth with thee, and I will save thy children. This is God's promise, brothers and sisters. This is not my words. This is what God said in his word. God is the one who delivers the captives. He takes away the captives. That was very illustrated in that story of Christian and hopeful that we looked at. And God says he will contend with those that contend with us. He will deliver us. So when God tells Jeremiah, if you've run with the footmen, they've wearied you, how will you contend with horses? God wasn't expecting that Jeremiah will be able to contend with the horses alone. God was simply reminding Jeremiah, I am with you. You're not alone in this. If you're tired because you're on your own, just remember, I am here, I'm with you. I'm the one who contends with those who contend with you. Remember that when you face your giant. David's testimony, years later, was a reflection of that experience that he had, and he continued to have, despite his failings, despite his falterings and his mistakes, he continued to have that experience and that connection, that closeness with God, which allowed him to experience deliverance and victory time and again. Notice the words of David here in Psalm 18, verses 29 and 30. It says, for by thee, that's by God, for by thee I have run through a troop, and by my God have I leaped over a wall. As for God, his way is perfect. The word of the Lord is tried. He is a buckler to all those that trust in him. David experienced that in facing Goliath. David experienced that when God delivered him from Saul. This is a psalm written about his deliverance from King Saul. David experienced that. He ran through a troop. That's an army, surrounded by an army. He runs through, he escapes. By his God, he leaped over a wall. What does it take for this to happen? I want you to think about this. Sometimes it's important to think about verses in a different perspective. When it says running through a troop and leaping over a wall, What does it take to do that? Someone will say, well, faith or knowing God, trusting in God, as it says here. But first and foremost, what it takes is a troop. For you to run through a troop, there has to be a troop. For you to leap over a wall, first off, there needs to be a wall. For you to face and defeat giants, what's the first thing that's needed? A giant. And then the decisions you make in response to that, trusting in God, praying, communing, focusing, all the different 5 decisions that we focused on today. And that's why David says this. Now that I have God, a troop doesn't matter. A wall surrounded by an wall, enclosed in, doesn't matter. By my God, I'm able to do that because he is a buckler to those that trust in him. Brothers and sisters, the things that are happening in the world, uh, it's crazy, and it's gonna get crazier. Are we ready? How can we be ready? Not by knowing the future and knowing in advance the plans of the enemy, but by doing what David says here. When we trust in God, don't let the craziness, don't let the giants overwhelm you and trouble you and cast you in a dungeon where you stay longer than you need to. Remember, God is your shield. God is your buckler. Battle is what makes good seasoned soldiers. We are to endure hardness as good soldiers of Jesus Christ. He is the commander of the army. The battle belongs to the Lord. So, as you face these giants, remember the 5 decisions that you can make in facing them so that you can overcome them and be able to contend with horses under the Lord's guidance and direction. That's my prayer and that's my challenge. And that's the reminder I want to share with you and with me. Let's conclude and close with a word of prayer together, if you would join me, please.